Me? Okay,
yeah, it looks great.
All right, well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. This is a webinar that is co-hosted by the Hisatsinom chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society. We have Dr. Christopher Schwartz, who will be talking to us about scarlet macaws and long distance exchange. We're really excited about this topic. Before we get to his PowerPoint or to his presentation, I will just go over some of the housekeeping things and tell you about upcoming events. So I think most people have done some Zooming at this point, but in case anyone is new to that, just a couple of things. So you can move the talking heads. You probably have a little square somewhere with me and Christopher, and you can just click on those and pull them out of the way if they're getting in the way of reading the slides. We do have live transcription going. That's not something that we really control. It's a Zoom feature. If it's helpful, you can turn it on from your command bar. If it's in your way and annoying, you can turn it off. It does pretty good mostly until we get into like technological terms or Native American foreign words. Native American words or foreign languages. We would like to ask you if you have questions, please ask questions, but put them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. It's a little hard for us to monitor both. And we're gonna hold all the questions till the end, but we will try to get to all of the questions. If you're having any trouble with the Zoom, you can always head over to our live stream on Facebook, and there's the address for it. Or all of our videos, most of our videos get put onto YouTube. This will probably be on YouTube later tonight or tomorrow. So it is also helpful to us if you subscribe to our channel on YouTube. The more likes and subscriptions we have, the more availability we get. So there is the address for our YouTube channel. For those of you who aren't familiar with Crow Canyon, our mission here is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. We also want to acknowledge the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. And Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. We currently have a challenge match. One of our trustees has made a challenge that they will match up to $50,000 in donations. So for every dollar you contribute, that'll be matched up to $50,000. Looks like we're up to about 29,000 at this point. So please consider a donation when you register for the webinars. We have upcoming webinars next week. We have some folks from Aztec Ruins National Monument, Lori Stevens-Reed, Aaron Adams, and Jeffrey Wharton will be talking about their research there and their current understandings of the great houses and the great house communities there. And then the week after, we have Shauna Diedrichs. We'll be talking about Ute rock art in Southeast Utah. Those are both at 4 p.m. on Thursday, next Thursday, and the Thursday after, 4 p.m. Mountain Time. We've been sharing this information for folks who want to make donations to Native American groups and Pueblo groups in the area. They've been hit hard by COVID. The need is still there, and we like to share this information. And you can see this on any of our videos, any of our more recent videos on the YouTube channel if you don't have a chance to write this down right now. All right, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Christopher Schwartz is a postdoctoral researcher at Arizona State University, where he earned his PhD in anthropology in 2020. He's an anthropological archaeologist who works on field and collections-based projects in the US Southwest and Mexico. His research focuses on long-distance exchange and interaction between the US Southwest and the Mexican Northwest and Mesoamerica. He studies how past humans interacted with animals and also archaeological applications of isotopic analysis. And he will be with us today in talking about scarlet macaws in the Southwest. We're very excited about this. All right, Chris, I am going to let you take it from there.
All right, great. You should be seeing my PowerPoint presentation now.
I see it.
Can you confirm? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much, Michelle, for that great introduction. I also want to thank Taylor Hasbrook for getting me set up and doing a practice run with me, and as well as the Hisatsinom chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society and Pro Canyon for sponsoring this talk, and the other great talks that they've sponsored over the past year or so that they've been going on. I've been really following along with these talks, and I've really enjoyed them. So it's really exciting today for me to be a part of the group. And so I want to start by stating that my research, or my interest in this research project, starts in Phoenix, Arizona, where I currently sit on lands that have been stewarded by the ancestral O'odham and Peeposh people that archaeologists call Hohokam. And I'm a long-term resident of Phoenix. I've been here for a long time. And one of the things I really love about Phoenix is that the legacy of indigenous peoples is really apparent in the canal systems and the platform mound archaeological sites and things like that that can be seen throughout the city. And I find the case of the Hohokam particularly interesting because of the long-term connections to Mesoamerican objects and materials and worldview. And in fact, the Hohokam chronology, how we understand time periods and the period names and things like that that we use to refer to different time periods, for the Hohokam chronology are pioneer, colonial, sedentary, and classic. And this refers to a pioneering group of Mesoamerican elites that colonized, became sedentary, built canals, and then experienced a classic period fluorescence. And we know, of course, that this is kind of a racist and colonialist narrative that really takes away from the accomplishments of pre-Hispanic peoples. But it was these deep connections to Mesoamerica that really got me interested in what I'll be talking about today, which is scarlet macaws, long distance exchange, and placemaking in the pre-Hispanic US Southwest and Mexican Northwest. And I'm going to say Southwest Northwest to refer to the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest because it's a mouthful, and I could spend half the presentation just repeating that word. So there's a lot in that title, and I'm going to start by saying that this work really sits at the intersection of long distance exchange, human-animal interactions, and how these concepts are tied up in processes of placemaking in the past. And exchange is a fundamental human behavior, right? People have always exchanged ideas, material objects, and all kinds of things. And in the early days of this project, I used to say that we take for granted that globalization has made it really easy to exchange goods, our words, even our faces over really long distances instantaneously. But I really don't think anyone feels that way today after living months and months of the Zoom life. But of course, folks in the past didn't have that luxury, right? And long distance exchange would have required a lot of work from a lot of different people involving the mobilization of resources as well as human labor across huge networks. And the amount of effort that's required to create and maintain these networks suggests that the things, I say quote unquote things because there are all kinds of things that move through these networks were really highly valued. But value, as we know, and other folks have talked about, is really something that's quite difficult to get at archaeologically. And so to really understand why people went through this effort, we need to get to a thorough understanding of what exactly was being exchanged and how these goods and items fit the social and economic and political context of daily life. So today, I'm going to address some of these questions in order to hopefully bring about a more nuanced understanding of human behavior in the past. And I'm going to show you the organization of the talk. I'm going to start by a background on approaches to exchange and then introduce my own approach, which of course isn't my own approach at all, but the material histories theoretical framework that stitches this work together and is drawn on the brilliant work of Anne Stahl. I'm then going to explore the many dimensions of scarlet macaws that make them important and dynamic objects of study and good proxies for understanding a lot of things about the past. Then I'm going to introduce the 3 case studies I'm going to use in this talk and apply the material histories theoretical approach to the role of scarlet macaws in placemaking in the Southwest Northwest. And then finally, I'm going to interpret some of these results through the lens of the archaeology of the human experience to look at what daily lives would have been like and how they could have been impacted and would have been impacted by people that had scarlet macaws as well as the birds themselves. So Exchange has always been of central interest to archaeology, right? But past approaches have really been limited. And early approaches to exchange were often kind of typological. We were just categorizing things and collecting more and more points of data, and highlighted things like variation in object forms and types, and were usually completely rooted in the economic value of objects, right, from a very Western perspective. However, we know that material objects and the significance and associations that we assign to them can be complex, multifaceted, and context dependent, right? I don't think any of us have forgotten how the rare luxury status that toilet paper and paper towels took on at the start of the pandemic, right? I think Clorox wipes are actually still in that category right now. But more recent and holistic approaches have sought to draw together the social, economic, and political conditions that motivated actors by exploring the benefits of drawing together rare objects from distant locales, and how acquiring, keeping, and circulating these rare and non-local objects can bring their keepers ritual authority and political standing. And this authority and standing has a really important role in processes of placemaking at central places, right? And by central places, I refer to regional population centers that are typically characterized by large-scale construction with public, socially integrated and public forms of architecture, higher room counts relative to surrounding settlements, as well as the evidence of integrative ceremonial practices. And all of these elements, right, large-scale social aggregation, the use of public forms of architecture, as well as ceremonies as a means of integrating people, are really essential processes of placemaking that create and maintain communities over time. And objects and materials, especially those that are rare and non-local, play integral roles in these processes by bringing legitimacy or authority to leaders by virtue of their use in public ceremonies, through their sacrifice in opening or closing deposits, or in origin stories, right, in oral traditions that can guide communities. And they can also either carry themselves or bestow power onto those who've learned the knowledge of their use and care, and allow their keepers to control who has access to them. But when we're looking back into the past, how do we understand the context of these rare and non-local objects that bring them significance, or how their treatment and deposition and value were maintained or transformed in different places and times? And to do this, I use a framework outlined by Anne Stahl that's called Material History Framework. And this draws from the field of materiality and material cultural studies, which examines in detail the complex interrelationships between non-human actors, including material objects and animals, and humans. And this approach specifically is concerned with how history is wound up in materials, and how materials are wound up in global historical sociopolitical processes, right? And the material histories approach focuses on the value of material sources for deepening and extending our understanding of the effects of historical global connections on daily life. And Stahl outlines this framework in her work amongst the Banda people in Ghana, right, where she uses archaeological and historical context to examine how colonization and the associated European objects and materials made their way into the local African material repertoire. But in doing so, they were oftentimes transformed or reinterpreted in their local uses and used in completely different ways and understood in completely different ways. And in order to create a material history, there are three different approaches, right? And those are biography, deposition, and genealogy. So the first of those is the biographical approach. And this is often conceptualized as like an object biography. And this builds on traditional use life approaches by exploring the accumulated life experiences of an object. And these accrue and change meaning over time. And more specifically, how objects are produced or procured from one context and then recontextualized as they're brought to another place in time. Deposition is the second component, and deposition is inextricably linked to the biography, and that it changes in meaning, significance, and use over an object's lifetime will then come to affect that object's deposition. And examinations of deposition identify the ways in which objects are brought together in specific contexts and highlight how objects of diverse backgrounds can be combined to form novel relationships that will then influence human experiences. And finally, genealogy is concerned with the reproduction and transformation of practice in time, and how over time practices will affect and influence human behavior. And so I think, and I feel that strongly that this theoretical framework has a lot to tell us about one particularly multifaceted and animate distantly exchanged object, and that object is the scarlet macaw. So scarlet macaws, even though they have a nearest natural habitat over 1,000 kilometers to the south, researchers have recovered the remains of over 500 scarlet macaws in pre-Hispanic settlements of the greater Southwest and Northwest area. And scarlet macaws are definitely not the only tropical birds found in this region. But given how few quantities of other locally available species like military macaws and thick-billed parrots, and here you can see on the right side of the screen the distribution of all three of these birds. Anyway, given how few of these other birds have been found at archaeological sites, there certainly seems to be a preference for scarlet macaws. And we know that these are scarlet macaws, in fact, because there are morphological differences in bone that have allowed researchers to differentiate macaw species, and as well as more recent studies of macaw mitochondrial DNA that have confirmed these morphological distinctions and offered some really interesting and new insights. So various other lines of evidence suggest that scarlet macaws would have been socially and economically important for people living in the pre-Hispanic Southwest Northwest area. From the Yucatan Peninsula to modern pueblos, scarlet macaws were and continue to be really rich in cosmological associations and symbolism. And they represent a wide swath of different things, including the color red, the sun, the south, fertility, agriculture, as well as different deities. And a number of contemporary pueblos retain parrot and macaw clans today, including Hopi and Zuni, and a few others that I'll talk about later. And the multicolored scarlet macaws figure into and are even central to some origin stories, as they're associated with clan migrations and the origins of social order in these different places. So it seems really clear that these non-local birds were very important elements of Pueblo cosmology. And more recently, Clara Kelly has written a great article about how scarlet macaws at Chaco may also be really related to the Navajo Downey Home Man narrative, which is a really, really interesting paper. And ethnographic and ethnohistoric accounts detail the importance of macaw feather trade, which made its way into things like Aztec tributes, the bags of Pochiteca or Ostomeca tradespeople that traveled throughout modern-day Mexico. And many have actually suggested that the more than 300 scarlet macaws and the evidence for large-scale breeding that was seen at Paquimé, as I'll talk a little bit more about in the presentation, was due exclusively to feather demand. People just need a lot of birds so they could get a lot of feathers. And even more interestingly, perhaps, those scarlet macaws can live over 50 years. Up to 75% of macaws from the Southwest Northwest area appear to have died between 10 and 12 months of age. So some have suggested that this may relate to a ceremonial sacrifice, right, related to the spring equinox that occurs and because macaws have very specific breeding seasons each year. This has recently been critiqued by Patty Crown in a really strong critique, but the deposition of birds with other rare objects and even humans seems to suggest that their significance definitely expanded into the bird's afterlife. And finally, scarlet macaws are capable of mimicking human speech. I find this so cool and incredibly interesting, and I think it remains very cool today at a time when we commonly see animals depicted speaking in movies and TV. I think in the past it would have been quite rare. But one thing I do want to say is that I don't think it would have been unprecedented, right? We very much live in a Western system where we don't associate speaking with animals, right? But I don't necessarily think that people in the past would have felt or thought the same way. And so hearing an animal, what we conceptualize as an animal speaking or talking, could have been something that really was a materialization of cosmology, more so than something that was really cool and unusual. So adding to this complexity is the fact that very few scarlet macaws have been recovered from archaeological sites in central and southern Mexico. Despite their proximity to these birds, people living in what is now modern Mexico really didn't seem to share the forms of interest that are shown by people in the Southwest, Northwest, where they really are consistently associated with sociopolitical centers in these larger sites, though not exclusively, I should say. So I'm going to be using this theoretical framework that I've kind of laid out previously to talk about the acquisition, treatment, and deposition of scarlet macaws at three sites that are fairly well known in the Southwest Northwest, right? And those are Pueblo Bonito and in the Chaco Canyon northwestern area of New Mexico, Wapaki in north central Arizona, in near Flagstaff, as well as Paquimé in northwestern Chihuahua. And so I hope that this approach will illuminate the dimensions that brought scarlet macaw's significance in local Southwest Northwest context, and also the use and recontextualization of scarlet macaws in processes of placemaking over time and space. So the first site I'm going to talk about today is Pueblo Bonito. This is one that's probably pretty well known to a lot of the folks that are joining us today, but I'm still going to say that Pueblo Bonito is a 650-room great house site that sits at the center of the Chaco Canyon system in northwestern New Mexico. It's really well known for its central location within these diverse and expansive long-distance exchange networks. It has a complex road, as well as irrigation systems, as well as a very dynamic system of settlements that expanded throughout the northern, southwest, northwest, that emulated this Chacoan architectural style that Barbara Mills talked about actually a couple of weeks ago in a really, really interesting talk. And excavations at Pueblo Bonito have yielded at least 35 macaws, 31 of which were identified as scarlet macaws. And a recent study by Adam Watson and colleagues found that the importation of scarlet macaws actually preceded these peaks of architectural expansion and population aggregation that occurred between 1040 and 1100 CE that we typically associate with the fluorescence of Pueblo Bonito. And they argued that the acquisition of cosmologically powerful macaws served to transform the elite legitimization, of power, which led to and didn't result from an apogee of Chacoan social development. So the largest quantity of macaw and parrot skeletons, which is 42 to 44, actually sits north of the border. Comes from Wapaki, which is a 100-room pueblo located 50 kilometers northeast of contemporary Flagstaff, Arizona. And Wapaki was inhabited right after the eruption of Sunset Crater, sometime between 1080 and 1090, when migrants entered the region seeking this newly arable land that had been naturally mulched with volcanic ash. So things would have been much easier to grow in. It would have been a great place for people to aggregate. And it's particularly interesting that Wapaki sits at this frontier zone, right, between the larger Chaco and Hohokam regional systems. And this may explain this mix of architectural styles and material culture and structures that are characteristic of both systems, right? Things like Chaco-style masonry and T-shaped doorways, as well as Hohokam ball courts. And so for my purposes and for our purposes today, we are particularly interested in its connection to these larger networks, right? That brought out objects like copper bells, shell bracelets, and scarlet macaws, as well as the adoption of ideas that brought ball courts and unroofed great kivas to the region. So the final site we're going to be talking about is Paquimé. And Paquimé is a 1,000 to 2,000 room Pueblo-style settlement in the Casas Grandes region of northwestern Chihuahua. And it's really, really well known because it has this very large site size containing very unique and expansive architecture. And it merged this Pueblo-style room box with traditionally Mesoamerican features like eye-shaped ball courts and platform mounds, as well as these incredibly immense collections of non-local materials, right? And this included hundreds of copper ornaments and turquoise pieces, millions of pieces of marine shells, and of course, scarlet macaws. And these incredible quantities of materials that were brought to Paquimé after 1200, as well as the mixing of these different styles, have led some to suggest that it was an outpost established by Mesoamerican elites. And this was something that Depeso had talked about in his initial excavations of the site. And others have said, as well as Depeso, there's this regional trade center, right? All these objects were coming into Paquimé, and it was used to transport objects north from Mesoamerica into the Southwest. And in the similarities with Pueblo Bonito, including the presence of Chaco-style T-shaped doorways, these extensive acquisition networks have led others to suggest maybe that the descendants of Pueblo Bonito may have established Paquimé. And more recent work, primarily by Mike Whalen and Paul Minnis, has led us to believe that it was more likely a ritual center that developed out of these local traditions and was importing these rare non-local materials to remain at the site. They ended up staying there over long periods of time. So in returning to the framework, this is how we're going to attack the problem today. I'm going to use the biographical approach to talk about acquisition. And here we're going to ask whether scarlet macaws were acquired from non-local sources or locally raised at these three Southwest-Northwest regional centers through radiogenic strontium isotope analysis. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. In the second component here, we're going to look at deposition. And this is going to be an examination that will ask how macaws were treated and deposited at three regional centers in the Southwest, Northwest. And this is something we did by reconstructing these contextual deposits from published and archival reports from each of these settlements. And then finally, in the third component, we are going to look at whether these patterns in the acquisition and treatment and deposition of scarlet macaws change or continue over time. So getting into radiogenic strontium isotope analysis, the ratio of 87 to 86 strontium varies with the age and composition of bedrock worldwide. And you can see the ages here, right, depicted on this USGS map of geological bedrock in North America. And this is important for understanding because as strontium substitutes for calcium in bone growth, trace amounts of strontium are then taken in as one eats and drinks local foods and waters. So we can test whether humans or animals are locally raised or migrants to a region by sampling strontium isotopes in their bone tissue and then comparing it to strontium isotope values that are observed in locally grown plants and animals. And so I'm not going to get into the details here, but this analysis required a lot of different things, including the construction of a local baseline, assessments of local bedrock variability, identification of potential sources of dietary strontium, as well as the analysis of trace elemental concentrations to assess whether there was contamination in bone tissue. And I like to say these things not because they're complex and make me sound smart, because they don't, but because I think it's important if there's any geochemists out there or people who are interested in these things to know that all these things were completed prior to the study and I'm not just making this stuff up. And so in this component of the study, we found that scarlet macaws were primarily locally raised. So first and foremost, I'm not actually going to talk about the Pueblo Bonito results here because I collaborated with a different group of people on this component of the study. And so these are kind of unpublished and haven't been released yet. But we do have a great sample from Wapatki and Paki-May. And at Wapatki, 17 macaws and one thick-billed parrot all demonstrated strontium signatures that were indicative of local raising. And you can see that on the right side of the screen here in the graph with the local baseline for the site that we constructed right here in gray. And there was a little bit more variability in the 29 samples that were examined from Paki-May, but what we found was that most scarlet macaws from Paki-May were in fact locally raised. And interestingly, this settlement with the most evidence for local breeding and raising, which we'll get into in a little bit, demonstrates the greatest variability in macaw procurement practices. So 19 of the 29 sampled macaw bone specimens had strontium values that were indicative of local raising, and 10 of those appeared to be non-local. So when comparing this with the Casas Grandes region sampling that has been done by Adrienne Offenbecker in her own dissertation projects, we can find that the strontium values falling immediately below and above the local baselines are consistent with both local strontium baselines and sampled human values from settlements located in the Casas Grandes region. So those falling below are consistent with settlements in South Central Chihuahua, including CH-254 and CH-159, and those falling above are consistent with the Cerro Huanaqueña area, which is 80 kilometers north of Paki-May near the modern town of Llanos. 3 specimens demonstrated strontium values that were higher than any measured in the Casas Grandes region, but they are consistent with extra-regional values elsewhere in the southwest, northwestern Mexico. So it's kind of tough to say exactly what was going on with these specimens because they do overlap with specimens found in parts of central and southern Mexico. But really interestingly, one strontium value sitting at the very highest point in the graphic is higher than any macaw sampled in the study and may actually be indicative of transport from somewhere in the Mimbres region of the Southwest, right? So in southwestern New Mexico, where Adrienne Offenbecker had published local strontium values from the 76 draw site that were between 0.7093 and 7097. So very close to what you see pictured in that specimen. So to examine the deposition of macaws at Pueblo Bonito, I'm going to draw really heavily here on the work of Caitlin Bishop, whose dissertation looked at all of the birds in the Chaco region. So she found that 35 macaws and 3 thick-billed parrots were recovered primarily from room contexts, as well as in Kiva J and the East Refuse Mound at Pueblo Bonito. And we've already established that macaw importation had preceded these larger peaks in Chacoan society, and that most macaws were restricted to this oldest northern arc of the Great House. But many of the birds of Pueblo Bonito were actually killed in roof or wall fall events, including 12 birds in room 38, which has been described by early excavators as an aviary for macaws. And this is really interesting. If you actually read into some of these initial reports, this room had just a bunch of macaws, obviously, as well as layers and layers of bird poop at the bottom that was still there, of guano that was still there when excavators got to the site. And Bishop also notes that Chaco's macaw collection lacks any types of human modification on the bone, which probably indicates that the birds were buried whole and that really, really good care was afforded to their deposition. No other types of markings or weathering or things like that were observed. And it was suggested that they were deposited in very secure, enclosed spaces, even for the 3 individuals that were found in the refuse mound, which is kind of not usual. So the death of 17 of Pueblo Bonito's macaws in roof fall events indicates that people were actively interacting with live birds while inhabiting the site. And because the contexts were largely closed off in this older northern arc of the settlement, access to macaws may have been restricted to very specific people. One macaw was deposited in association with an infant human burial, which would appear quite intentional given the material-rich burials that are seen elsewhere in Pueblo Bonito, and I'm sure have been talked about in other presentations. And in their analysis of ritual fauna at Pueblo Bonito, Bishop and Sam Flad, working together, note that for every room at Pueblo Bonito in which a macaw was found, at least one of those macaws was deposited on or beneath the floor level. And they interpret this pattern to suggest that macaws were associated with construction, occupation, or initial closure of these very important spaces. At Wapaki, things are a little bit different. We found skeletal elements from 42 to 44 macaws, as well as 3 to 5 thick-billed parrots. And we heard a little bit more about Wapaki when Irina Gruner was given a talk a couple weeks ago, and she actually found that there were a little bit fewer macaws, and she may have been right on this one. I was using a very liberal method called number of identifiable specimens, where you actually look at all the bones instead of trying to minimize and look at how many individuals there might have been. So in a pretty serious contrast to Pueblo Bonito, 21 of Wapaki's macaws and parrots were represented by only a single element, and 4 additional birds were identified by only 2 elements. So only 10 of those skeletons could be considered complete or nearly complete. And this is something that is really kind of challenging to interpret. And it's also difficult to say whether this is the result of early excavation methods or looting, or it was actually representative of like scattered deposition of macaw and parrot remains at Wapaki. So at times, sheep herders and park rangers like actually inhabited the rooms in the Wapaki room blocks. So this is going to have a really, really important effect on the subsequent analyses and how much we can derive from those analyses. So, but we can say that all of the macaws recovered from Wapaki came from the earlier southern room block, and that many were associated with the earliest constructed rooms at the site that sit in the central core. That's pictured right here at the right. And human modification on the bone seemed to be very limited in my own observation, but I did not actually do that systematic and detailed analysis. And this is in progress right now at the Zoark lab for the Northern Arizona University. And but what I was able to see is that there were very few bone pathologies observed on these bones. So it's important to say also that this southern core and room block, or the southern room block, excuse me, also contains this core of rooms that exhibited Chaco-style masonry and T-shaped doorways. And these are thought to be affiliated with ideas or people from Chaco Canyon. And macaws and parrots were recovered from room 73, room 41, in both of which were among the earliest rooms at the site and part of this Chaco core. And room 35 is also among the earliest constructed settlements of the site and contains somewhere between 6 and 8 macaws. And unfortunately, these remains were kind of combined and shuffled at some point during excavation and material analysis. So it's been kind of tough to pick apart exactly how many birds were in that room and where exactly they were sitting, but we'll return to that a little bit toward the end of the presentation. And macaws and parrot skeletons that were recovered as complete or nearly complete typically came from these layers of fill above the surface of the room, or above the floor surface, I should say, or trash fill in room context at Wapaki. And the word trash fill is a really kind of ambiguous one that makes it kind of tough to say, because it was recorded so early, it makes it kind of tough to say that whether this is post-depositional fill that came in long after the site was inhabited, or if this was intentional fill, right, that was used from clearing out rooms, or if things were placed in there in a really intentional way. And I mentioned already that somewhere between 6 and 8 macaws and parrots were recovered just inches above the floor in the fill of room 35. And in these intentionally buried birds, though they have been kind of scattered, were given treatments that seem to be really similar to humans recovered from Wapaki. And this is really cool and interesting, right? They were wrapped in matting and deposited in direct association with pottery. Human and macaw remains were never really found in direct association, but nearly in this context, in room 35, they were found in very, very close in subsequent layers. And in every room that contained, in all of Wapaki that contained an intentional macaw burial, they also contained a human burial that seemed to have been given similar treatment in these shared spaces. So the deposition of macaw remains perhaps may relate to closure events or marks of returns to a place of continued importance, right? It's still tough to tell with the trash fill and how things were organized there. But this is kind of attested to in Wapaki's deep archaeological history of inhabitation, right? Which dates to between 1500 BCE all the way into 700 CE. and continued significance in oral traditions that people have been continuing to return to this site as an important place in the landscape. And I'm going to return to this later in the presentation. But unfortunately, 21 of the 48 total macaws and parrots from Wapaki have no recorded contextual information or have lost contextual information during the screening of materials. So there's a lot definitely that's been lost there that we may not ever get to find out about them. All right, so turning to Paki-May, over 500 macaws and parrots were recovered from Paki-May. This is the most numerous of which were scarlet macaws. And their remains were found in context throughout the settlement, but were located primarily in plazas and rooms, most notably in Plaza 312 of the House of Macaws, which is pictured here, in Plaza 311 in the House of the Serpent. Oh, I'm sorry, in Plaza 311 in the House of the Serpent, which is depicted here at the right side of the screen. And the intentional burials of these birds were just scattered throughout the plazas underneath adobe macaw pens, which you can see at the bottom and right side of that image there. And these pens were intended for keeping the birds. And they were just scattered underneath them and scattered throughout these plazas and rooms. And no real detailed study, unfortunately, has been done on the cut or tooth markings from Paki-May's macaw population. But there were only 9 instances of bone tool modifications, which means that macaw bones were probably not being repurposed for other things very often. And what we do know is that bone pathologies were much more common and much more numerous in turkeys than they were in macaws. And turkeys and macaws occur in equal numbers at Paki-May. And so it seems to be that these pathologies, the pathologies that were there, were suggestive of things like disease, attacks from humans and other birds, poor diet, and lack of sunlight. And the macaws and parrots certainly seem to be afforded some special treatment relative to other birds at the site. So macaws were pervasive at Paki-May, right? As can be seen in this distribution map that we have here on the right of the screen. And even if only a handful were present at a time, right? Paki-May was inhabited over a couple hundred years. They could have been seen and heard throughout the site, right? Knowledge of macaw keeping really doesn't seem to have been restricted to one segment of the site. Macaws and parrots were rarely found in room fill or trash or in contact with floors, as was seen at Wapaki. And one exception is the room/plaza 1908, which collapsed in this burning event and resulted in the immediate death of 44 live birds. But for the most part, you really see them in intentional burials. And they were occurred in these burials either individually or with other birds, including macaws, thick-billed parrots, turkeys, and ravens. They were recovered in contexts that were associated with human remains. They were recovered in contexts that were associated with military macaws. Some of them had military macaws and human remains. Some of them had turkeys, human remains, and scarlet macaws. So you can see that it's a pretty complex picture. And although these patterns in macaw deposition are not mirrored elsewhere in the Southwest Northwest, they're not completely unique at Paki-May. I think it's important to say that turkeys were also given similar treatments, right? They were locally reared and possibly also bred. They were buried with humans and macaws and other birds. And this happened across Paki-May as well. And I should also say that Whittlesey and Reed have suggested that some of these elaborate patterns were also mirrored at Grasshopper Pueblo in eastern Arizona. So finally, returning to the genealogical component of the study, I'm going to explore the spatial and temporal trends in the patterns of acquisition, treatment, and deposition of scarlet macaws. And what we find in this component is that there's some consistency in the acquisition of scarlet macaws at regional centers. All sampled macaws and parrots from Wapaki were locally raised, and this is consistent with evidence of macaw keeping in features such as the aviary in room 38 at Pueblo Bonito, but really runs contrary to the importation of macaws to Wapaki, which is something that we've read elsewhere, and something where you really don't see any real evidence, somewhere that you really don't see any real evidence for macaw aviculture, aside from the presence of the birds themselves, right? There were no pens, there wasn't an aviary or anything like that at Wapaki. And Paki-May really demonstrates a much more variable pattern of macaw acquisition. And this suggests that birds were both locally raised at the site, acquired from local settlements, and perhaps acquired from extra-regional settlements as far as Mexico, but also as close as the Mimbres region in the Southwest. And this mixed strategy of acquiring macaws from these various sources may have been adopted to meet demand that outweighed a local supply of scarlet macaws at the settlement. But overall, you see that there's considerable variation in the deposition of scarlet macaws at these regional centers. The restriction of Pueblo Bonito's scarlet macaw population to the northern arc of the settlement and the lack of surface modifications on scarlet macaw remains really indicates that there was restricted access to and pretty careful control over the deposition of these birds, and perhaps also the handling of these birds. I think Bishop and Fladd's observation that macaws were consistently deposited in these subfloor contexts due to their association with construction, occupation, or closure of these living spaces is a really interesting one, and is also something that is unique to Pueblo Bonito. At Wapaki, all macaws with this clear contextual information were recovered from the southern room block, and many of these came from a segment of rooms that were closely related to Chaco Canyon. We're part of this Chaco core that they call it. And the macaws for which we could construct depositional histories, we found that they were deposited in the room fill. They were occasionally given similar treatment to and in shared spaces too with young humans, though never in direct association. And in contrast to this controlled deposition of macaws of Pueblo Bonito and Wapaki, Paki Mesa macaws are just scattered throughout the settlement's plazas and rooms in a really unrestricted fashion. So it seems clear from this patterning that macaws were pervasive at Paki May, both in life and in death. So even though there is this considerable variation, there do also seem to be some similarities, right? For instance, the deposition of macaws and humans in shared spaces occurs at all three of the case studies. Even though it's rare at Pueblo Bonito and you never see it in direct association at Wapaki, the decision to bury macaws and humans in these shared spaces, I think, speaks to a similarity in how macaws figured into cosmology and worldview throughout the Southwest Northwest. And because many of Wapaki's macaws were deposited in this oldest, most Chaco-like segment of the southern room block, the connection and connected to human interments, the deposition of macaws and parrots may echo these cosmological principles that were first observed at Chaco Canyon, but in doing so, it's happening in a very distinctly local way. So I want to reflect for just a second on understanding human experiences in the past, because scarlet macaws also offer an incredible vision into what life might have been like for past people. And to do so, I use an approach called Archaeology of the Human Experience that explores the question of what it was like to live in the past by asking really practical questions about processes that archaeologists already understand to some degree. So for example, bioarchaeologists will often report on things like skeletal trauma, but a bioarchaeology of the human experience would ask about the effects of a broken leg on an individual, right? Could they walk after the injury? How long would it take for them to get to that point? Would their gait change? Could they still complete daily tasks? Could they do the things that they were doing before they were injured? And so we have some idea of what it's like to transport small objects like copper bells or shell jewelry, but a macaw would have been a completely different story entirely, right? They're loud, and they really wouldn't respond well to being thrown in a bag and carried hundreds of miles. And despite quite a bit of time passing since the inhabitation of Paki May and Wapaki and Pueblo Bonito, the fundamentals of macaw biology really haven't changed. So past macaw keepers would have faced really similar challenges to those that contemporary macaw keepers face today. And so I mentioned earlier that 500 macaws and parrots were recovered from Paki May. And of course, they may have just been deposited over this 200-year span, but what would living with even just 10 macaws have been like? What did it sound like? Well, it would have been incredibly loud, right? Scarlet macaws have these shrieking calls that have been measured at 102 decibels from a distance of 15 feet, right? And that is louder than a motorcycle and some rock concerts even. They certainly could have been heard from surrounding settlements. They would have been heard throughout Paki May, and people would have been hearing them fairly regularly. They call more in the morning and more in the evenings, right? So there would have also been this kind of daily regularity to when you were hearing the macaws. You would also have to watch your fingers, right? Because in their bite in pounds per square inch is stronger than that of a lion. And macaws can be really aggressive and are among the most non-compliant of birds. They're very independent-minded and intelligent, and they're known for picking at their cages and undoing the locking mechanisms to let themselves out. And so they probably would have made short work of adobe. They constantly pick at their surroundings, and they also practice geophagy, the consumption of soils, to acquire additional nutrients. So the pens that we described in this talk and that you can see here on the left would have had to have been constantly repaired. And given their small size, it's really unlikely that adult macaws could have been kept regularly inside of them. They are, however, the exact size of bins that contemporary macaw breeders use to raise macaws that have recently been hatched. And here you can see some image that Kelly Taylor sent to me that really clearly depict these young macaws in the bins of kind of a similar size, as well as some other fun ones. So suffice it to say that their non-compliant temperament and independent mindedness would really have made breeding these birds, keeping these birds and breeding these birds really difficult. What would it have been like to transport macaws? I think this would have been equally difficult, right? Traveling with scarlet macaws would have been a challenge, even for experts. And fully grown scarlet macaws would have made lots of noise and gathered substantial attention. The massive stainless steel cages that we see today that are required for their keeping would not have been feasible, of course, in the past, right? You couldn't easily put a cage on top of a backpack or something like that, or just carry it around. Macaws could, however, fly alongside a human for long stretches of a journey, especially if it were paired to that person, right? If it had a relationship and a bond with that person. So carrying an egg, a hatchling, or very young macaw would have been a much simpler process. And that is attested to here in these classic period members black and white pottery vessels that probably depict juvenile scarlet macaws lacking their really distinctive long tail feathers. And you can see them sitting on a burden basket here on the right and on the head of a macaw keeper on the left. So I bring up these challenges not to point out that macaws would have been handfuls, which they certainly would have been, but to point out that caring for macaws would not have been an easy task, and it would have required really substantial knowledge. And that being said, many of the practices that past people utilized are currently being used by contemporary macaw breeders and owners, right? So they're not unprecedented, and they're very similar to things that people are doing today. But the presence of macaws themselves would have created a really unique social experience. The soundscape would have been different. Visually, it would have been different from many of the places that people had seen in their lifetimes. And people would have had access to these birds for sacrifice or for their feathers, for ceremonies and attire, as well as use in ritual objects like prayer sticks, as we've read about in the ethnographic literature. And it's typically been assumed that macaws were actively bred at Pakime. And no doubt this large bird population, adobe pens, things like the presence of eggshell really seem to corroborate this evidence. But there are some really considerable challenges to breeding macaws. And this includes the near absence of breeding age birds, the challenge of sexing macaws, including, which look identical, right? Can't be distinguished from looking at the birds alone. And so we use today contemporary DNA testing or have to observe these sex-specific behaviors. The fact that female scarlet macaws will often lay unfertilized eggs, so the presence of eggshell and eggs is not necessarily evidence that macaws were being bred, as well as the fact that reproductive success for scarlet macaws can be really dependent on the physical and psychological health of the birds. And finally, the successful bonding of two birds would have made relationships with bird keepers really, really challenging and perhaps even aggressive, right? You can't just easily handle birds that are breeding and that are bonded to one another because they'll want to protect one another. And so I point out these challenges again, not to say that it would have been impossible, but to assert the great knowledge and care and attention that would have been required to do these things. And much of this presentation has dealt with the reasons that one might want to procure a macaw, but I think there's also some really, really interesting negatives to consider when investing in macaw acquisition. And I hate to point this out because of the pandemic, but macaws also could have been pretty serious vectors for disease. Macaws can carry and spread psittacosis, which is a zoonotic infectious disease, which could have spread to both past macaws as well as their keepers. And this disease is one of the reasons that city pigeons have such a bad report today, right? They can carry psittacosis and transfer to people. And today the disease has been observed to spread rapidly through macaw populations. And though only 5 to 8% of birds can be carriers, this number can really rapidly increase to 100% when birds are subjected to stresses. And some of these stresses that have been studied include transport and breeding, right? As they almost certainly were in the past, and as we've talked about today. So again, these are things to consider that would have had a really, really massive impact on the lives of past people. So returning to now this concept of placemaking that we talked about a little bit earlier, Tim Cresswell in his introduction to place states that the creation of space occurs through reiterative social practice, right? It's made and remade on a daily basis, and space, as well as the making of places, should be considered something that's performed and practiced. And I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that ceremonies and performances and traditions and even daily life contribute to the making of place. Rare and non-local objects are often important elements of those social practices that create space. Living, and if this is true, living and animate scarlet macaws were central to all of these activities in the past. So in the acquisition component of the study, we saw that macaws were locally raised at Wapaki and Pakime. Resources were marshaled for their care, and at Pueblo Bonito, access to the birds and perhaps also the knowledge of their care was really restricted to specific people or groups of people. At Pakime, macaws and their care would have been common knowledge. Things had really, really changed by the time we got to Pakime times. or perhaps even accessible to most parts of the settlement. And this is a huge difference to how things were at Pueblo Bonito in earlier time periods. When looking at deposition of scarlet macaws, we found that at all sites, humans and macaws were deposited together, indicating that their shared experiences definitely persisted into the afterlife, right? Birds and people that were together while alive were then left to be together in the afterlife. And though there were many differences in deposition over time, Wapaki, a site that echoes many placemaking strategies observed first at Pueblo Bonito, shared some patterns in macaw deposition that may indicate a shared worldview with earlier times. And at Pueblo Bonito and Paquime, people constructed different kinds of facilities and things like that in order to care for live birds, which indicates both their significance to the local order, but also it indicates that who had access to those birds also would have been important. And this became much less restricted over time. So exploring the human experiences associated with macaws really clarifies how much knowledge was required for their care. And this could have been maintained by specialists or even general population by the time that we get to Paquime. And this knowledge would have bestowed prestige and political authority to those who had access to it. Being a person or a group of people who were able to make macaws speak or fly or do any other kinds of specific behaviors could have brought substantial privilege to those people. And learning to keep macaws and perhaps even breed them would ensure access to this multifaceted and powerful animate being. And it also demonstrates the ways that the presence of macaws would have set settlements apart from their counterparts, right? If you consider places like Paquime, Pueblo Bonito, and Wapaki, the landscapes, the soundscapes, and the experience of people visiting a site would have been very different from their experiences at other places, especially if birds were left to fly above the sites and you could hear their sounds and things like that over time. And this would have brought power and standing and separation to the groups of people that lived there. But it also could have brought negative experiences like widespread disease. And I just want to touch again on scarlet macaws and oral traditions. I've said before that these findings hint at shared and not shared ways in which ideology can be manifested in different times and places in the Southwest Northwest, as well as how people engaged with these ideologies. And although the practices surrounding scarlet macaws may differ over time and space, there are central figures. They seem to be central figures in origin stories and clan migrations and oral traditions of tribes throughout the Southwest Northwest. And some of the most prominent stories involve tribes that have parrot and macaw clans, such as Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, Santa Clara, and Taos. And one prominent story that was told by Jim K1 Waitewa was about an older relative, right, who asked if he had found an old man with his pets, which were macaws and dogs, while excavating at Wapaki. And without knowing anything about the excavations, he was able to describe an individual from room 35 who was found very close to young dogs and macaws. And I didn't talk today about the dogs that were found very close to the macaws and the humans in room 35, but this is exactly the context that this person was referring to. So the presence of macaws at locales as far back as the 9th century and this remarkable time depth of in-person interactions with macaws may really help to explain how macaws and parrots became interwoven into cosmologies and oral traditions that continue to endure in descendant communities today. And I think this story and others like it really hammer home how essential it is that archaeologists and anthropologists take non-Western ways of knowing really seriously as we're moving forward. And so with that point, I'm going to wrap it up just by saying that if you're interested in this research, please do check out, here's kind of a reading list. Please do check out the following references if you haven't already. And there's some really good ones in here. And I want to be particularly excited in a moment of shameless self-promotion for a forthcoming volume from the University of Arizona Press that came out of an Amarin seminar called Birds of the Sun, Macaws and People in the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest that I put together with Stephen Plog and Patricia Gilman, which will be coming out in 2022. So definitely look out for that. There's a lot of what I've said today is informed by the work that folks have contributed to that volume. It should be really interesting. So I also want to state that none of this work happens in a vacuum, and it could literally not have happened without the efforts and organizations of the individuals listed here. I also want to take a chance to say thank you to my co-authors and collaborators on a piece on the human experience, who are Kelly Taylor and Michelle Hegman. And some folks might have seen that at the SAAs this year at the annual meeting. But I also want to plug it again because it will be coming back at PECOS in just a couple of weeks. So you should be hearing more from me about that. And so with no final ado, I also want to say thanks to the Hisatsinom chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society and to Crow Canyon for having me here today. It has been an absolute pleasure. So I'm going to leave my screen up as was suggested to me by Taylor so that we can, so I can receive questions and kind of go back and forth. So Michelle.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting and so fun. I especially loved your discussion of what it's like living with macaws. I've thought a lot about macaws at Pueblo Bonito and how they might have been talking and might have been oracles, but
yes,
I hadn't really thought about how you would hear it throughout the building, and that really appreciate those insights.
Yeah, of
All
course.
right, we have some questions. First of
Great.
all, somebody would like to know, I've already cleared this up for myself, but are those macaws on your shirt?
Yes, they're macaws on my shirt. I hope you can see them. They're, yeah, these little guys. Here's one flying right out of the pocket too, which I always seem to like right here.
All right, so somebody asked if there are macaws at other sites besides the 3 that you've talked about.
Yes, that's a great question. There are macaws at many other sites besides the 3 that I've talked about today. And I think it's also important with scarlet macaws, maybe even young scarlet macaws. And Pat Gilman has done some really excellent work, as well as her co-authors have done some really excellent work looking at people procuring scarlet macaws into the Mimbres region and how that perhaps also deals with these much larger social transformations that happened in the area. So such as you know, not the not using great kivas anymore, and other kinds of things that were going on.
Oh, another follow-up question. Were there macaws at Aztec ruins?
There were macaws at Aztec ruins, I believe. Yes, I think there were multiple macaws at Aztec ruins.
Yes. What do macaws eat? And how difficult would it have been to procure food for them in a place like Chaco, for example?
That is also a great question. So the interesting thing about this is, I didn't get to talk about a lot about this today, but one of the things that you have to do when you're doing a strontium analysis is that you have to come up with a really tight estimate of what the animals were consuming, because you want to take plants and things like that that have rooting depths very similar to those, so you know where they were getting the sources of strontium. And so in doing this project, we had a really extensive look at like what kinds of things macaws could have eaten in these different environments. And the fact of the matter is that macaws could have eaten like succulents, they could have eaten different kinds of fruits and nuts, cactus fruits and nuts and things like that. They could have been procured from the Pueblo Bonito area, could have been procured from the Paquimé area, from Opaki. And a lot of those things that occur, pinon nuts and things like that that occur in these different places would have been really good for macaws, would have been a really healthy diet for macaws, and would have been considered very similar to what they were eating in their natural habitat, which are mainly fruits and seeds and nuts and things like that. But we know from looking at other isotopic systems and sampling macaw bone for these other isotopic systems that they were eating a diet that was very, very much composed of maize or corn. And so it seems like the macaws were actually being fed a remarkable amount of corn, very, very high quantities of corn and almost nothing else, which would have put them in pretty nasty health, and which is something I think we see, especially at Paquimé, where you have these really, really large quantities of birds, and they seem to be, there's all these different kinds of problems and nutrient problems and deficiencies that were associated with them.
A couple of people are asking about the use of feathers. Do we know if there were particular colors of the feathers that people were most interested in? How were they used? Somebody mentioned the sash at Edge of the Cedars. I'm wondering if there are similar artifacts.
Yes, yeah, there was a talk from Jonathan Till about that, the macaw feather sash, and many other things from Edge of the Cedars. And so that we think are the kinds of things that they would have been used for. A really interesting thing about macaw feathers is that even though they're not, I wonder if I have one. I do have one here. Oh, but it's not. This one's mostly red. They're really multicolored.
We still want to see it.
Oh, sure. So anyway, you can see, I think this one came from one of Kelly Taylor's macaws, Sedona and Bonita. But you can see that it's red, right? The feather is primarily red. And then as you get to the tip, it's quite blue. And so there's lots of feathers that will be, you know, almost, the long tail feathers are usually red, but they'll oftentimes have quite a bit of blue in them as well, or yellow. And the macaw feathers from like the chest of the bird and will have a lot of those other different feathers and other bird feathers from the wing. And so they come in a wide array of feathers. We typically associate them with being red, but but a whole manner of different colors could have been used or procured from macaws to be used in different kinds of things. And one of the things I didn't want to, this volume that we're putting out in the coming year has some incredible images of how those feathers are used. And I think the background slide of your part of the presentation really demonstrated in a really nice way that multicolored effect. So I didn't want to steal those images for this presentation today because I don't want to take away from the authors and folks that contributed to getting them there. But yeah, I think oftentimes we associate their feathers with red, but they come in all different kinds of colors and could have been used for various different things.
A related question about prayer sticks. Did they use feathers or taxidermy birds? Not sure about that.
So yeah, this is a great, I think that Patrick Lyons and Patty Crown just about a week ago or a couple of days ago or something like that. But yes, I would think that they probably were used in bundles. I don't know if I have any direct records of them having been used in bundles. So I don't want to say concretely that this is true.
Yeah. Okay, sort of a different question. Somebody asked what psittacosis is.
Oh yeah, it's a chlamydial infection, basically that spreads through bird populations. It spreads into turkeys. I didn't mention this in the presentation, but macaws and turkeys occur in these crazy numbers at Paki-May. And so it also spreads in turkeys, and it causes things like, oh my gosh, like mucus, throat mucus and things like that. Really, I believe it spreads through droppings, right, that are affected and irregular. And it then can get into other birds, and it spreads very quickly. But when birds are stressed and their immune system's being hurt, they don't exactly deal with diseases in the same way that humans do. And so they can have a really tough time with that and become infected really easily. So, and I also want to say about psittacosis that this idea that the whole bringing out the idea of psittacosis came from Kelly Taylor, who runs a nonprofit called Sacred Scarlets here, dedicated to information and spreading information about scarlet macaws in the contemporary and past Southwest. And she had this brilliant idea, and we're kind of like, oh wow, like let's look into this. And yeah, I really think that's a really important line of evidence. That's something people haven't considered previously, and hopefully we can get some samples going and work with some geneticists to look at that.
Yeah. Are macaws currently prevalent at indigenous locations in the Southwest? I guess are Pueblo people still using macaws?
Sure. If they are, I don't know about it. And I can no way say that they're not, because I don't know. And that if they are, that information could be really privileged and really, really important, right? I think a lot of this presentation has been about how important macaws could have been to people and the reasons why they would have been important to people. And so it would not surprise me if there were live macaws being kept at many different locations in the Southwest, but that information was really closely guarded by parrot clan or macaw clans or other folks.
Okay. Let's see. Does the occurrence of macaws in the older part of Pueblo Bonito suggest they were there primarily in the early era of occupation, or only that they utilized the older ribs for them?
That's a great question. I would say that the direct radiocarbon dating of those macaws that has been done by Adam Watson and Steve Plog and Doug Kennan and those folks and Rich George, I should say. Oh, I guess with the DNA too. But that direct dating of macaw bone is what indicates that those birds were associated with that earlier portion of the settlement. So the fact that they were also placed there could have been, I think this person is probably getting at the fact that that could have been coincidental, right? Just because the macaws were placed there doesn't necessarily mean that they would have been associated with the earlier use period and time. But the direct dating of those birds, which has been done, is the evidence for them being associated with those earlier periods of time.
Well, and they could have been placed there because that was an important part of the holding. Yeah.
Yes, and they could have been kept over long periods of time too, and then placed there at a later time, but we'd still get that same radiocarbon date.
Okay. Any thoughts on whether or how these birds fit into the concept of flower worlds that we've been hearing a lot about?
Yes, I don't want to take too much away from Michael Matthewis's really, really great presentations, but I think that macaws are absolutely pivotal in the flower world, and that their use and the spread of macaws probably corresponds to the same time periods that the flower world, I guess, canon of objects and ideas and things like that was coming out of the of Mexico and into parts of the Southwest, at least in the later periods of that. One thing that I do want to say though is that I think that the idea of macaws may have spread with those ideas. I think that the use in how macaws became distributed on the landscape, I don't think it follows such a simple, not that the flower world in any way was simple at all, but it's really hard to say that these macaws came as part of this shared way of thinking, because you do see this variation over time and space. And I didn't even get into today, right, these smaller sites that also have macaws. So do I think that they were associated with the flower world? Absolutely, 100%. But I also want to caution that I think it's really difficult to say that there was a suite of practices and shared behavior that people all adopted at a similar time, because there's so much variability in what we're seeing in the treatment of and deposition of macaws.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as simple. I think I can say that. And I think that Mike and other folks studying the flower world would really agree with me that there was no simple way of looking at it and combining those two things and saying that they're the same.
Yeah. Somebody's asking about how far macaws can fly. Could they have flown distances from pueblo to pueblo?
Yes. And some macaws do. I don't believe they're migratory, but they can go really, really far distances at any given time. And I think they could definitely have flown from pueblo to pueblo. I think macaws probably fly, I think it's like 100 kilometers a day or something like that is like one of the tops, like 80 miles or so a day. Macaws can have been known to fly. That may be a vast overstatement. I apologize if that's way wrong. But it would have been tough. There would have still been a lot of predators for macaws out there too. And so, but macaws can be trained to do some pretty incredible things. So I'm not going to say no to that.
And would they come back?
Yes. So this is something I wrote about, but didn't get to talk about today. But I think that if you had put these birds at Paki May and just let them fly freely, they would have, I think they probably, knowing that they would have been fed at Paki May, could have flown freely, could have gone out in the atmosphere and flown around. And I don't think they would have had predators, right? There are other larger birds, especially if they reach the ground. But I think that they could have probably flown freely and would have known to come back. Joel Polka is an archaeologist I'm pointing actually toward his office right now at Arizona State University. And he's talked to me, he works in the Lacandan Maya region of Mexico and into Central America. And he's talked to me about macaws that will basically sit on the roofs of houses and come in the mornings and feed, and then go off for the day and then come back and feed, because there's archaeologists that have put in these like tents and houses and things like that that'll feed the macaws. And so archaeological projects will acquire these macaws for short periods of time.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Could macaws have been, would they have had to be transported by one person, or could they be passed from one person to another? I guess that's maybe a behavioral question too.
Yeah, I think it would have been easiest for them to have been transported by one person, because for many reasons that I didn't go into great detail today, but it's certainly hard if you are not, macaws will become bonded to a person. And if you are not that person, you have to be very careful in how you treat that macaw, and whether they may not sit on you, they may not let you. Those macaws that you see at fairs and things like that are really well trained and social and grew up with being touched and handled by a lot of people. So it really depends on how the macaw was socialized early in life. If they were around lots of people, then that might be something that's more possible. If they weren't, that's going to be really, really difficult. And so I would think that it would probably be easiest to travel with one person or a couple people. And I would also think that there were specialists, right? People that carried these birds and bred these birds and raised these birds that would travel over on the landscape and would then be able to bring you a scarlet macaw, or who you'd know to go to procure one.
Right. So somebody asked, I guess as part of your PhD research, have you interacted with macaws?
Yes, of course. And I'm kicking myself now for not putting a picture of me with a macaw on here. But yes, I've had the really good fortune to work with Debbie Schweikart over at the Arizona Bird Store, which is just over in Mesa, very close to us. And a lot of this started when I went in and had just basically talked to her about what it was like I had a whole bunch of questions. I talked to her about what it's like to have a macaw, and it was really fun. I got to hold a macaw and do all this cool stuff, and it was very interesting to kind of put a face and animal, I suppose, to some of the questions that I've been really interested in. And since then, I've worked really closely with Kelly Taylor, who has two beautiful macaws, Sedona and Bonita. And so her and I've spent days up at her place hanging out and talking to her about, what macaw behavior and how you could transport and raise a macaw, and with the backdrop of her macaws making noises and hanging out with us.
They live a really long time, don't they?
They do. They live a very long time. Yeah. Over up to 50 years, I think, in captivity. And yeah, it might be less in the wild for sure, just because there's more predators and things like that, competition. But
okay, I think this will be the last question. Is there significant evidence of wing injuries resulting from plucking of feathers, or does it appear that flight feathers were allowed to develop naturally?
That's a great question. There is a Florida graduate student named Randy Fladbo who's actually writing her dissertation on this topic right now, and she is looking at the pathologies and things like that occur from feather plucking. And so it's not something that I know a ton about. In talking with her, yes, the answer is yes, that there are these different pathologies that occur from feather plucking. Whether those are flight feathers specifically is kind of a different and maybe a little more difficult thing to assess, just because people were interested in the feathers regardless, right? So even if they may have been interested in the feathers to prevent them from flying, but we have a lot of evidence that people were very interested in using the feathers and having the feathers for other reasons. So those two things could be the same, or could look the same, I guess, from our perspective.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention a couple of people have asked whether we can send your reading list, and I will look into that.
Yep.
Taylor,
Happy to share.
Okay. So I guess we'll wrap up at this point. Thank you so much. That was so interesting and also really fun. And I love all the images. And we really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Wonderful. Thanks to you. Thanks to the Colorado Archaeological Society. Thanks to Crow Canyon, and thanks to everyone who tuned in at home. I really appreciate you spending your Thursday afternoon with us.
All right. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next week.